As you can see tonight, we're going to be studying about stumbling blocks. So if you want to turn to Mark chapter 9, we're going to be uh, looking at a lot of verses in that chapter as we look at stumbling blocks. Mark chapter 9, verse 42 says, "But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea." Now, that is a severe warning. If you think about a big millstone around somebody's neck, there's no way you can survive that. You sink right straight to the bottom immediately. And so Jesus is telling us there's something worse than that. And so we're going to see as we study this what is worse. And in the Bible, stumbling blocks refer to actions or behaviors that lead others away from their faith or into sinful behavior. And believers are encouraged to be mindful of their actions and attitudes to avoid being stumbling blocks to others. And so we want to study this tonight to see what are stumbling blocks and how we can avoid these things. Uh, as we look at Mark chapter 9, a few things stand out to me. One is preeminence. Preeminence can cause stumbling blocks. So if and as we look at Mark 9, we're going to see some additional information about these stumbling blocks. So in Mark chapter 9, starting with verse 33, Jesus explains that the way of discipleship is by serving. Let's look at that reading, verses 33 through 37. "And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he began to question them, 'What were you discussing on the way?' But they kept silent, for on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. And sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, 'If anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all.' And taking a child, he set him before them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, 'Whoever receives this one child, whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me does not receive me, but he who sent me.'" So we see here that the disciples had a problem. They were discussing who would be greatest. And of course, Jesus asked them what they were discussing. He already knew. He was just opening up a conversation. But he could read their minds, and they were discussing about who would be the greatest. And so, knowing what they were thinking, he took a child into his arms, and he used that child as the example of what they should be, and that serves also as an example for us as Christians as what we should be today. In Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, it says, "Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, Assuredly I say unto you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So this is the same incident that we're studying in Mark 9, but this is what Matthew records, and it gives us a little bit additional information. And Jesus told them that they need to humble themselves and be innocent like this child, and to be servant minded. And so as we think about this problem of preeminence, or those who think that they're greater than others, certainly this can be a stumbling block. And to avoid it, we need to be humble and innocent like a child and servant minded. Uh, those who make themselves greater than others or preeminent can certainly cause stumbling blocks to others, like Diotrephes. You recall Diotrephes in 3rd John verses 9 and 10, it says there, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words. And not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren and forbids those who wish to putting them out of the church. I think we see here that Diotrephes was becoming a stumbling block and putting stumbling blocks in front of the Christians here. And John calls him out. John says he's going to deal with him when he comes. And we see that he would not allow the Christians there to receive John and the other brothers, and those that wanted to, he would put them out of the church. So this is a man who had a problem with preeminence. He wanted to be the boss. He wanted to be the greatest in the church. It was his way or the highway, and we see that that some suffered because of it. It became a stumbling block for those who were trying to do what's right. And you know, I've been in churches where some try to be greater than others and try to make decisions, and usually these are smaller congregations that don't have elders, and so one or two or maybe one family tries to take over, and I have seen that, you know, they would cast people out of the church, and it also leads to division, and I've seen that as well. So these can certainly be problems in the church, and so preeminence is one of the stumbling blocks that we need to avoid as Christians. Another thing that's brought out in Mark chapter 9 is matters of opinion. Matters of opinion can become stumbling blocks for people sometimes. And we see here that John learns that some unlikely people are also disciples too. Look there in Mark chapter 9, verses 38 through 41. John said to him, Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to hinder him because he was not following us. But Jesus said, Do not hinder him, for there is no one who shall perform a miracle in my name and be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. For he who is not against us is for us. For whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because of your name as followers of Christ, truly I say to you, he shall not lose his reward. And so we see here that John saw these people trying to cast out a demon in Jesus' name. And John said, we tried to forbid him from doing that. And John thought that because they weren't following along with Jesus like they were, that they were not disciples. And so the point here that I'm making is just because someone does not believe exactly the way we do, does not mean we should count them out. Now, when I say this, I have to put some parameters around the statement, because this applies to matters of opinion or expediency and not doctrine. Now, when I talk about matters of opinion and expediency and not doctrine, let me clarify what that is. For example, we have a command in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25 and 26 to assemble with one another and not to forsake that assembly. And then in Acts 20 and verse 8 and other places also, we see that the disciples met on the first day of the week. They observed worship, items of worship on the first day of the week. So we can put those things together and it creates a doctrine, an example and a command, or several examples about the first day of the week. That creates the doctrine that we should assemble on the first day of the week like we're doing now, like we've done this morning, and worship God. That's doctrine. And no one can argue against that. Not successfully anyway, because that is doctrine. There's no gray area there. But there's matters of opinion and expediency. And what are those? Well, what time do we meet for worship? Do we meet at 9 o'clock or 10? or 11? What time? Those are all matters of opinion. And what do we when do we observe the Lord's Supper? Before the preaching or after? Those are matters of opinion. And so when it comes to matters of opinion, we shouldn't be so set on having things our way that we cause problems in the church. We have to avoid doing that. And expediency is things like, well, we're commanded to sing. Well, how are we going to sing? Well, we can put the words up on the screen. We can have a songbook. We can do what the ancient people did, sing in rounds, where the leader sings a verse or a line, and then the audience repeats that line. So there are different ways that we could sing, but we have chosen to have songbooks, so we can follow along the words and understand what we're singing and have some music too. And we could also do it by heart, and that would probably be a mess if we sang by heart all the time. But thank God we have songbooks. But songbooks are an expediency because that helps us carry out the command to sing. And that's what an expediency is. And so we shouldn't argue about expediencies either. If we as the brethren or the elders or whoever decide that we're going to do things a certain way, and someone causes problems with that, it could become a stumbling block. And so we have to be careful about that. We have to show love for one another, and we have to get along, and we have to not always have our way, because that's selfish. So being insistent on your way can certainly cause stumbling blocks. So we have to be careful about that. Well, let me talk about some other things concerning matters of opinion. In Romans chapter 14, verse 13, Paul says, "Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in our brother's way." And if you go back and you look at Romans 14, it's talking about the eating of meats. That's what the context there is. Because some Christians had come out of idolatry. They had come out of idolatry. So anything associated with idolatry was bad for them. And they could not eat meat because they were afraid that it had been offered to an idol. While other people, they were okay. They didn't. Paul said, "Don't question where the meat came from. Just eat it and be thankful to God." And so some didn't have a problem with it. Some did. And so we see here that these were matters of opinion. But Paul warns us not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in someone else's way. And it also says in 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 9, "But beware lest somehow this liberty of yours becomes a stumbling block for those who are weak." And so someone who would have liberty might be the person who thinks it's okay to eat the meat. And what Paul is saying is, don't try to bind that, or don't let your brother that has a weak conscience see you participate in that, because it may make him sin. It might become a stumbling block. So those are things that we have to be aware of. And examples in our day and time might be observing certain days or not, or eating certain things or not. The best example that comes to my mind is Christmas. Okay. I've been around some who think that it's not okay to observe Christmas. And this is not something we're commanded about. There's no authority in the Bible about Christmas. So this is something people can personally observe or not. And I have seen some that had a problem with it. And so if we knew someone that had a problem with it, we would have to be careful about that, so as to not cause them a stumbling block. And then there's other things like the eating of pork. Okay, I've seen some people didn't think you should eat pork. I think it's okay. I love pork. I love Christmas too. I celebrate it too. But if we had someone here that had a weak conscience on that, who thought that you shouldn't do those things, then we would have to be careful not to do that around them so as to cause them to stumble in their personal faith. So I wanted to point that out as matters of opinion as well. Okay, the last thing I want to cover in Mark chapter 9 is what I just call offenses. And offenses can also be called stumbling blocks or causing others to stumble. And Jesus warns about offenses. Starting in Mark chapter 9, verses 42 through 48, Jesus says, "And whoever causes one of these little ones who believe to stumble, it would be better for him if with a heavy millstone hung around his neck he had been cast into the sea. And if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than having two hands to go into hell, into the unquenchable fire, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than having 2 feet to be cast into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. And if your eye causes you to stumble, cast it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than having two eyes to be cast into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched." First of all, we see Jesus call out some little ones. And even though he is holding a child while he is talking to the apostles, he's not talking about this child that he's holding. The little ones here are believers, and today they are Christians. That's who Jesus is talking about. So, causing a Christian to stumble or a believer to stumble is a bad thing. And Jesus tells us here, you know, it's worse than having a millstone hung around your neck and you cast into the sea, which, you're going to die if that happens. But Jesus said there's something worse than dying this way, and that is hell. And Jesus emphasizes that for us. I see here in this passage that we read, there's two kinds of stumbling blocks. There's external stumbling blocks and there's internal stumbling blocks or offenses. And external stumbling blocks come from others who cause us to sin or to lose our faith. In Revelation chapter 2, verse 14, it says, "But I have a few things against you, because you have those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality." And you remember the story of Balaam and Balak. We've talked about that recently. And of course, Balak was the king of Moab, and he called for Balaam, who was a prophet, to come and curse Israel. And every time that Balak would take him out on a high place and he opened his mouth to curse Israel, only blessings would come out. God would not let him curse his people. And so what did Balaam do? Well, Balaam saw that he wasn't going to be able to accomplish cursing the people, so he had a better idea. He told Balak to put this stumbling block before the people, to tempt them with sexual immorality and with idolatry. And so that's what he did. And the people sinned, and a lot of people died. The people who were committing sexual immorality died, and Balaam even died. He was killed in the battle after that, as they went out to take vengeance on those who had caused these problems. And so God hates it when someone puts a stumbling block in front of someone else. God hates it, and we need to remember that. Okay, internal stumbling blocks come from within us. They are our own problems. They are things that cause us personally to stumble. And these are things we say, things we do or think. And based on what Jesus tells us in this section, it's what we do with our hands, it's where we go with our feet, it's how we control our tongues, our eyes, our thinking. And so things in the world, when we see or interact with those things, they can sometimes cause internal stumbling blocks. And we as Christians need to understand the things that cause us to stumble personally. And we need to try to avoid those things. First of all, we need to know God's word very well in order to avoid these things. And then we need to know how to apply it in order to be perfect before the Lord. But Jesus says 3 times in this section that it's better to enter into life without a body part, whatever body part it was. But he says it 3 times. It's better to enter life without the body part than to keep it and go to hell. So you see, Jesus put a lot of emphasis on this. You think if someone says something 3 times that it matters? Absolutely. Jesus said this 3 times. We need to really heed this because we can fall victim to this ourselves. You know, hell is real. It is a terrible place, and it's to be avoided at all costs. Okay, that's all I have to present from Mark chapter 9. Now I want to talk about human concerns becoming stumbling blocks. And when Jesus when Jesus began speaking of his coming death, Peter rebuked him. And in Matthew chapter 16, verses 22 and 23, and this comes from the NIV, I like the way it rendered it. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Okay, so Jesus is the one that rebukes here, and he rebukes Peter very sharply. In fact, he calls him Satan because of what he was doing. It was a temptation, and Jesus saw that this was coming from Satan. Now, I don't think that Peter intended to cause a stumbling block to Jesus. This seems to be very unintentional. Peter thought he was doing the right thing, but he wasn't. So we need to learn from this that it is possible for us to be a stumbling block unintentionally. And again, we need to know the scriptures very well to know what's acceptable and not acceptable to God. We need to know what his requirements are so that we can do them and so that we don't fall into this problem of becoming a stumbling block unintentionally. But we see here what Peter's problem is, and the Lord tells us what his problem is. He was focused on human concerns instead of the concerns of God. And that's what Peter's problem was. Peter was only thinking about the here and now. He was thinking about keeping Jesus and keeping him as a king and his kingdom and being part of that kingdom and probably even being the greatest, as we have already seen. And so Peter was only focused on worldly things, human things, things that were carnal, and not on the things that God had in mind. He had in mind that Jesus was going to die on the cross for our sins, and if that had not happened, we would all be in bad shape. So we, just like Jesus suggested to Peter, we need to focus on God and godly things. And if we do that, it will help us so that we don't unintentionally become a stumbling block to somebody. So we must be very careful in this. So as we conclude, let me just make a few things, say again a few things that I had already said. Christians should be humble and servant-minded so that we don't have a problem with preeminence, so that we don't cause stumbling blocks to our brothers and sisters. because of wanting to be the greatest in the church. We should not insist on our way for matters of opinion and expediency. These kind of things can tear a church apart. We need to be not selfish and love our brothers and sisters and not let this be a problem. And we should not bind our opinions on others, because if we do this, or if we act in a way to not observe what someone else is trying to do from a matter of faith, we could cause them to stumble. And we should not be stumbling blocks and cause others to sin, whether it's intentional or unintentional. We should not do it, because those who do so will be condemned to hell. And like I said, that's a real place, and it's a place we don't want to be. We need to avoid it with all costs. Well, I hope this lesson on stumbling blocks has helped you maybe bring some things back to mind that you already knew, but have emphasized some things. I will offer the invitation at this point. If anybody is in need of the invitation, if you need to repent, if you want the prayers of the saints, whatever the case might be, come while we stand and sing.
Not all are gone.